Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is the 2022 Scholarship in the 21st Century, Improving Accessibility in Digital Publishing. Today, we have Lisa Janick Hinchliffe. Did I pronounce that right? Yeah, I was close, hopefully. And Garreth Tigwell will be joining us. We're going to have kind of a panel discussion. Garreth is going to start us off, and we would like people to hold their questions to the end of the presentation. If you want to, any participant can write a question in the chat feature, and we'll make sure to try to address everyone's questions at the end of the presentations. So I want to thank everyone for joining us again. The caption feature will be going with this presentation, so you just need to turn that on. We also have an interpreter who will be spotlighted during the event. So I think that covers all of the administrative notes. So Garreth, if you would like to take it away, please do.
Okay, thank you. I'm just gonna share my screen. Cool, I think we're good. So, hi everyone. I'm Dr. Garreth Tigwell. So I work here in the School of Information at RIT, and I'm pleased to be here today. And I'll be talking about some ideas for how we can make our academic papers accessible. So my research interests cover design, accessibility, and human-computer interaction. My research focuses on improving the accessibility of digital spaces for people with congenital, acquired, or situational impairments. And usually this is through increasing the support that allows designers to improve the accessibility of their work for end users. So that's kind of like my general research. Specifically, but for this talk, I want to share some recent findings from a collaborative project with colleagues from the University of Dundee in Scotland. So our paper is called Author Reflections on Creating Accessible Academic Papers. I've included a QR code just for convenience if anyone wants to read this paper that I'm going to be talking about today. It was written by Rachel Menzies, myself, and Mike Crabb. And we had a lot of fun working on this because we're all accessibility researchers. So we got to have many introspective discussions about not only the findings of the work that we conducted, but our own approach to writing the paper itself and how we could ensure it was accessible as much as we could possibly make it. And this work was also, it kind of started over 2 years ago. So we're really happy that it's been published this year in the ACM Journal Transactions on Accessible Computing. So I like to try and give an audience like one easy to remember piece of information so that if you forget anything else that I'm going to talk about today, then this is one of the key findings from our paper that you can keep in mind. So our paper is quite long. It is a journal paper. So there are a few things I could have chose to highlight. But the thing I really want to say that is most relevant for today's talk is that institutions have an opportunity to increase the support offered so that academics create fully accessible publications. The publication of academic work comprises of many stages, from the conception of a research idea to publication. I have an example timeline on the screen. This is really kind of emphasizing 4 areas that's kind of typical in the steps of research. So planning, conducting, writing, and publishing. The timeline's not to really be taken as definitive since there's always going to be variations at each stage based on preferences or requirements of both authors and publishers. But for the most part, it's a typical standard process. And it also highlights the different kind of steps where researchers will make decisions that could have consequences for the accessibility of their work as well. So academic papers, they comprise of many different parts. Sometimes, we come across a paper that's only text, but often we have papers that include things like tables and images and diagrams, anything that helps to convey the story that the paper is telling. And I'm going to refer to those kind of parts of the paper as content elements. And I also want to clarify that in my talk, when I'm referring to accessibility, it's in the context of disability. So can people with disabilities and impairments read the final paper? And I don't mean only access the text that's in the paper, but also all of these other content elements that make up our academic work. So academic publications are a key part of knowledge dissemination. However, the problem is that academic papers are often inaccessible. So we know that content elements help to tell a clear story in our academic work, but a large-scale analysis of research papers from 2014, from last year actually, found that 97.6% had accessibility issues. And those research papers came from areas such as biology, computer science, physics, and sociology. So the problem's extensive, despite there being various guidelines out there, such as the W3C's web guidelines. So although web guidelines were not made for academic papers, they are partly useful since PDFs are digital documents. So there's kind of an overlap there with the guidance. Also, some professional bodies offer advice and try to require paper submissions to be accessible, but often they place more emphasis on making PDFs accessible for people who use screen readers rather than detailed guidance covering a range of access needs. And so for anyone here who doesn't know what a screen reader device is, it's a device that supports people in accessing and interacting with digital content when visual information is unavailable. So it will read aloud the text in a document. It might also describe an image if that image has been assigned an image description. Blind people are one group who typically use screen readers, but there are also other people who use screen readers for various reasons. So making our papers screen reader accessible is very important, but we wanted to ensure that academic papers are also accessible for people with other impairments and disabilities as well. We conducted two studies. The first, we reviewed 330 papers from the ASSETS proceedings between 2011 to 2020, so about a 10-year period. And we chose ASSETS because it's a top-tier conference on computing accessibility, and the authors are required to make accessible PDFs. And we wanted to understand what type of content is included in those papers, and we also made observations on possible accessibility issues as well. We also ran a series of interviews with 13 academics who have published within top-tier HCI and accessibility venues to understand how and why these specific content elements are created, and to ask authors to reflect on how they approach making papers accessible and what challenges they might face. And our participant sample represents quite a diverse range in terms of where they were at in their careers. So we had PhD students through to Professor Emeritus. So we ended up recording about 3,866 content elements across those 330 papers. The table that I'm sharing is only a high-level overview. So if you check out our paper, you'll find a more detailed kind of breakdown of this. We have additional tables that provide a deeper analysis of different types of content. So for example, on the slide, I just have a column for charts. We actually break that down into different types of charts and how many are in each year of papers. I want to quickly share an example where we recreated the breakdown of types of images that we found. So sometimes authors include photographic images of objects or scenes or screenshots. We also found that for each of those three types, there would sometimes be cases where they're annotated as well. So the authors are providing additional information on top of those images. Authors also sometimes include drawings and diagrams to share ideas, or maybe they're showcasing the outcomes of the participant activity. So again, for time, I'm only sharing just some examples here of insights into like the type of images that we had. But overall, there is a wide variety of use in different content elements that appear within papers. We observed issues with how content elements were constructed. And this can result in part of a paper being inaccessible for disabled people. So again, for time, I'm only going to share some reconstructed examples that, so for instance, we found instances where tables were used to create a chart. Rather than embedding an image of a chart, they used a table. And this can be an issue because, for example, screen reader users, they're going to encounter text and blank cells. And those cells that are filled with the color, the screen reader is not necessarily going to read that information out loud. So the screen reader user is not going to necessarily understand what is actually being represented here. On the right side of the slide is another example of what we call complex tables. Because it's no longer just a table with text. This has text and images within the kind of content element. So just to kind of run through a few more examples of issues that we found, there were poorly designed and complex charts as well. So a common issue with that we found was poor use of color and layout, which would be difficult for some people to read. So for example, people with low vision or impaired color vision will find the first and the third chart difficult to read. So in that first chart, the gradient variation in the blues is not really distinct enough for people to be able to determine where one of the bands starts and one of the next band, begins, and so on. A solution to this would be to use a pattern instead. So similar, the chart at the end is using red and green, and if someone has red-green color blindness, it's going to be difficult for them to distinguish between those different bars. Now, even if you don't have a vision impairment, you could still find this difficult to view. So if we think about, when we like to print our papers, if you print the paper out in black and white, then you're going to lose that visual information. And now a much larger number of readers are going to potentially come across issues or challenges reading the content in these papers. The middle example is a chart that is cognitively demanding. Research in general is quite critical of 3D charts because they're difficult to interpret clearly. So this is, just another example of a type of content element that we would come across that is increasing the inaccessibility of papers. If you, again, check out our paper, we have more discussions on other issues that we observed, such as layout, formatting, and mislabeling content. So the results of our interviews was very enlightening. So we kind of, I mentioned that we took the findings of this kind of review of papers, and it helped us formulate an interview guide to kind of speak with authors to find out what they're doing. And, we found a lot of interesting insights into why, why papers are structured in the way that they are, and potential challenges that authors are coming across. Sometimes accessibility issues are the result of constraints in the publication process. So for example, when a venue has a page limit, it forces authors to be creative in fitting information onto a page at the expense of accessibility. So if you think back to that previous slide where I had the 3D chart on in the middle of the slide, 3D charts can fit a lot of information into a very small area, and it's an example of this trade-off. So authors have chosen to employ this space-saving approach, but on the reader side of things, now they have a paper that's more difficult to read. Another point I want to make is that authors who initially had an accessible paper will sometimes find their efforts undone due to the pressure to keep reviewers happy. So reviewers may ask for content to be added or changed or removed, and authors don't really want to upset reviewers at the risk of their paper being rejected, especially if they're academics early in their career or students. So that's another kind of factor into papers being inaccessible. Next, I want to share that making fully accessible papers requires a lot of expertise, and even among accessibility researchers, we're typically only experts in our main subdomain of accessibility. So often research teams don't have a diverse enough spread of accessibility knowledge. Also, when the lead author on a paper is a student, they're still learning, and they're still learning a lot about the publication process and what guidelines there might be out there. We found that students are typically feel that the current guidelines aren't sufficient, and there's just not enough help out there. They want more help and resources to help them during this process. Another issue is that the software being used to make content elements and also produce accessible PDFs can be part of the problem as well. So one example is Adobe Acrobat's accessibility features. Putting to one side that they're very difficult to actually use, and there's a whole learning curve there anyway. Those features are actually paywalled. They're only with the paid version of Adobe Acrobat. And we found that students and even faculty don't always have access to that resource. And there's not really any good alternative as well. So sometimes they're submitting papers that aren't actually accessible because they don't have the tools to actually make accessible papers. And the final point I want to highlight is that sometimes authors' efforts can be removed when the papers are processed through a publishing system, or maybe an open access platform. So for example, the ACM have their new publication system that doesn't actually output a tagged PDF for screen readers. This is also the case for arXiv as well. arXiv's become very popular in recent years, but it doesn't allow you to submit a tagged PDF. You have to submit the source files of your document, and then they're going to generate a PDF on their end, and that compiled PDF is not accessible for screen readers. So what can be done? Well, we outline many recommendations which can be mapped back to the publication process. We also highlight who is typically involved in that process. For the audience today, I'm just going to cover some recommendations about what universities could do and the library as well. So the first idea would be provide education and training for students and academics for creating accessible content and PDFs. The second one would be provide access to the tools that will support students and academics in creating accessible papers. And the third suggestion would be require accessible paper submissions within the university or the library, whoever. So for example, university repositories could require that the preprints or maybe dissertations that get submitted need to be accessible. And what we hope with this is it's going to try to establish a new culture for creating accessible papers as a standard. And then, it might have this ripple effect to kind of just make accessible paper writing more standard part of the process. That's sort of the high level overview. I'm happy to answer questions in a little bit. The other thing that I would just want to quickly say is if you do have a look at the paper, there's a section at the end where the authors, so myself and my colleagues, we reflect on the discussions and the challenges that we faced while writing our own paper, which it gets a little meta, but yeah, it was really interesting to just sort of reflect on those processes.
Thank you, Gareth. That was great. Lisa, would you like to start your presentation?
Yes, let me uncloak.
Okay.
I always feel like it's like a real woo moment here. So it is my absolute pleasure to be invited here to present, with on the panel here today. And I think the organizers have done a wonderful job of pairing us because I'm going to dig into a factor that Garreth just ended with, which was this mention of the archive, which is one of the preprint servers that exists out there in the world. And so the study I'm going to be sharing the results of is a preprint server accessibility study that I conducted along with 2 graduate students here at the University of Illinois. And our question that we'll be asking here is early access to research, access for all. And so a little bit of a play on the open access and accessibility, which Garreth also sort of mentioned, that we're talking here when we say access. In my case, everything that we're looking at is also openly available because it's on a preprint server, but the focus is on the accessibility. So a little bit just high level here today is that we investigated the accessibility of preprint server platforms and the files that they serve in order to identify accessibility issues and suggest possible remedies. For me, I came to this because it's a foundational consideration from my perspective for how librarians can advocate for accessibility, which we currently do many times with our contracts when we don't have the ability to leverage a library licensing contract to do so. And then the additional question, as libraries increasingly rely on preprints and other versions of articles as alternatives to subscribing, what are our obligations if we push readers to those if there are issues with accessibilities? So my driving motivation here was to really think about how libraries needed to think about preprint servers from an accessibility standpoint, which is, of course, not to undercut in any way the importance of the actual readers having access to the content. But I wanted to provide that framing for you because it impacts, obviously, the way we then went about this research, which was what that driving thing. So our project goal was investigating this in order to identify accessibility issues, but then also what could we do as libraries to attempt to remedy this? I want to give credit here to 2 graduate assistants, Sarah Ali and Mimosa Shaw, who worked with me on this project and conducted a great deal of the detailed analysis work. I also want to define the way we operationalize the term preprint. We use the definition from Kirkham et al., which is that a preprint is a non-peer-reviewed scientific manuscript that authors upload on a public preprint platform, and they make it available almost immediately without formal external peer review. So we are increasingly, as librarians, obviously aware of this, and certain fields have a very strong preprint culture. Now, what that elides is we had to actually sample first the preprint platforms. And how do you get a sample of preprint platforms so that you sort of are looking at both the effect of the platform as well as the content? Because if we look at all the preprint servers that are hosted on the OSF preprint server platform, they will all have the same platform issues. And so we wanted to sample across, but there's of course no random sampling one can do. So we had to do intentional sampling. So our criteria is that to be included in our potential sample is that the platform had to self-identify itself as a preprint server. Submissions had to be open. In other words, it was not a private server. So this took out any institutional repositories, for example, that might claim that they host preprints because they would host them only for people at their own institution. We also were restricted in our ability to look at preprint platforms that were operating in the English language due to the limitations of the researchers and our ability to navigate other languages. Also, our ability to actually assess in other languages, anything that were, for example, would be to read right to left. Many of the same principles that we use in our left to right reading languages would be affected by that. We also wanted a wide range of disciplinary representation, volume of preprints, different hosts, and different infrastructures. So a whole messy process occurred, and we get to the right-hand side of this slide where we say which are the preprint servers that we specifically looked at, and we are identifying both the server as well as the host here. So we looked at OSF preprints from the Center for Open Science, SSRN, which is owned by Elsevier, Archive, hosted by Cornell University Library at that point, medRxiv, which is hosted by Cold Spring Harbor Lab, and APSA preprints, hosted by Cambridge University Press. So we did manage to get pretty much all the platform infrastructures and then different subjects, although you'll notice the arts and humanities are not represented here, except to the degree they might appear in the OSF preprints. We also then had to figure out, okay, how many preprints do we look at on each server itself? And so we had to sample off each server. To do that sampling, we wanted something that would be able to be searched on all of the different platforms. And so we searched for COVID-19, since 2020, 2021 gave us a topic that everyone was writing about. We also only looked at the web pages on the platform that did not require a login. So there are a number of platform features that are only accessible once one logs in. So we only looked at those that were truly publicly accessible web pages. And we also looked across the web pages that they be representatives of the site's features, such as commenting, emailing and citation tools, PDF previews. So here we are looking at not just the works themselves, but also the platforms hosting the works. So the content we evaluated was the home page of the preprint server, the search page, where you enter your search terms, the search results page, where you get that long list, and then we downloaded and accessed 3 preprint articles and their associated downloadable files. So every preprint typically has a landing page, and then from there, one downloads the associated files, which are typically PDFs, but not exclusively. We use the accessibility criteria articulated through the WC3 Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA, for those who are very into the technical here. These criteria particularly address the needs of people without perception of color, with limited vision or without vision, people without hearing, people with limited manipulation or reach and strength, people with ADHD, and learning disabilities and dyslexia. So as you can see, this does not cover all possible disabilities that someone might have, but a particular set of them. We also looked at these, so we looked at these key concepts across web accessibility. Keyboard navigation, can you navigate the site without a mouse? Document structure and forms. Are all of the search tools, web forms, buttons, etc., consistently structured and follow established practices so that they can be accessed in diverse ways? The visual presentation, accessible to people who have seizures or color blindness. And is there any ability for the user to alter the visual representation to something that is more in keeping with their needs? Alternative text when there is images, and questions of accessibility of audio and video. And then what about all this dynamic content and widgets that exist on web pages? So again, we were doing both a platform assessment as well as a content assessment. So these are the things that we were looking at when it came to the platform itself. We did a qualitative assessment process using a number of automated testing tools. Adobe Acrobat Pro Accessibility Check was, of course, very important for our PDFs. The University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign had its own tool, which is called the Functional Accessibility Evaluator, that has been developed locally and then provided out. And we are fortunate to have a very strong campus disabilities unit that helps all of our units with this and develop this tool. And we use the Google Chrome Dev Tools, specifically Lighthouse. We also did a manual testing practice go through, informed by DK University's WCAG conformance testing methodology. Sorry, so much technicality here. So each sampled web page and PDF was reviewed twice against the WCAG guidelines. So we have the findings from both our automatic review tools as well as our manual review. And then we synthesized each of those for ourselves into one evaluation report per preprint server. We then were able to look across those 5 evaluative reports and say, okay, what is the state of preprint server accessibility? So we found that it varies widely. We did find mostly the latest web accessibility techniques. We also found content with room for improvement and a lot of inaccessible features on the websites themselves. Most web content tested can be navigated, but there are major accessibility issues with the search tools that are given. Often the filtering options are unlabeled or the buttons are unlabeled. There were these cases where there would be these forms and you would get caught in the dialogue of trying to fill out the form. You just couldn't move through it unless you had the ability to use a mouse or to read the screen yourself. We also found, ironically, that many of the error messages were inaccessible. So a user who was trying to use an alternative means, which was the system was giving them feedback that something wasn't working, they actually could not access that feedback. We also found a great deal of content that was only available by hovering over something, which is, of course, very difficult with a manual disability, dexterity issues, but almost impossible when you have screen readers. So if you can't know that something's there until your mouse glides over it, it's essentially not accessible. We found low color contrast is often an issue, and we were a bit surprised by this because this is relatively easy to test and solve. But by far and away, not surprisingly from our first speaker, the largest area of concerns were the PDFs that we downloaded themselves. We found many PDFs of our 15 were wholly inaccessible. We found even some that were readable, which is good, but we did not find a single one that was fully accessible. We, in even just downloading 15, found some preprint PDFs where the entire preprint was an image. So each page was a scanned image. So literally somebody had printed it out, laid it on a scanner, and only uploaded the images. So if we found that in just 15, either we just got randomly lucky or this is a major problem. I think this is why perhaps Archive says, please give us your source file. Because we did find in general better accessibility of PDFs when authors submitted code and the preprint server generated a PDF versus when the author themselves just uploaded a PDF. So these are questions that came up for us. Was, can the library truly recommend a preprint over the version of record if this kind of accessibility control is not in place? We also raised questions as we looked at these about the quality of the accessibility content. So having alt text isn't the same as having good alt text on an image. And so this raises question of how much is good enough, both maybe to meet the letter of the law, but more importantly, to provide the kind of intellectual access we would want for scholarly materials. We also were thinking a lot about the onus of accessibility. ADA often puts this on the individual to advocate for themselves. And we noted that in digital content, there's at least 4 parties that have to be considered: the technology, the underlying technology, the content host, the content creator, and the user. And the user themselves is typically not in a position to overcome systematic problems that are created by actions of the other 3. We note as well that it's very difficult to develop the kind of accessibility expertise to actually do this kind of auditing. It's detailed, complex, and iterative. And so we believe this is why accessibility audits often get outsourced, if they are done at all. And we posit that institutional repositories, though excluded from the scope of our studies, may face these same issues as well. And so libraries may need to ask themselves about whether we are providing accessible content through our institutional repositories. We did share a reach out to each of the preprint servers that we evaluated and offered to meet with them one-on-one if they wanted a review of our findings. Our reports were not provided to them in text, but we did want them to know that we had done this, that we had studied them, and that we were willing to have a conversation with them. And I'm pleased that a number of them did take us up on that and have a conversation with us. So I'm hopeful that there is interest in improving this situation, but it is not a very positive story to tell about the preprint server accessibility at this point. Thank you so much for the chance to share this, and I'll look forward to our conversation here now as a panel.
Thank you, Lisa and Gareth, for your great presentations. I learned a lot. One of the roles I have here in the Wallace Library is I manage the open access publications, specifically open access journals, and the company that we use to host our open access journals, as they rasterize the PDFs that go up for publication, a lot of the paragraph tags are stripped out of our documents, so they become almost completely inaccessible. Blind readers can still read the documents, but it's very frustrating for our readers. We've gotten feedback that they can't jump through the article like they would want to because a lot of the information is gone. So I guess one of the questions I'm going to just throw out to both of you is what advice related to accessibility would you give to someone in a scholar or library or institution looking to create an open access publication?
So I would, maybe I'll start, and I think
Sure.
Gareth has some other scholarship I saw on his website that I think really addresses this in a very great detail. So I will say that one of the things I would say is there's a difference between the individual author creating a work that is accessible and the kinds of considerations that, say, a library or a publisher has to have if they are bringing up a platform. So I think the preprint server accessibility study we did sort of really underscores that there were a number of accessibility issues that would have prevented you from even getting to the inaccessible PDF. So, so as a library, I think we have to think about a broader scope. And then I also think one of the other things I've seen that has troubled me a bit is preprint servers or even library-based publishing operations sort of saying, well, we're not responsible for what people post. I'm troubled by that. Because I think then what you're trying to sort of say is that, well, we're just doing the same role that Facebook plays or something. And I think that's really disclaiming the role that we're seeking to have in the publication process, which is to provide dissemination of high quality information. And so I don't think we get off the hook just by saying, oh, well, we didn't press the upload button. Garreth, I think you've got some great advice on your site, though, of like for individual authors, what they can do.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think I totally agree with your points. I think they were great. I equally, and I think I can speak on behalf of my co-authors as well. I think we're also very much of the mind that libraries or other institutions or whoever it is, publishers need to take more responsibility for this. There's lots of stakeholders involved, and it all contributes to the outcome of an inaccessible paper. I think in terms of I guess if I was to speak just on the kind of the creators, so like the authors themselves and what the libraries could do, I kind of mentioned towards the end of my slide, like kind of training and resources. I think that, especially when we spoke to kind of students and early career academics, we're all still learning, as we go, and especially the students. And so I think that there's a willingness there to make accessible work, but not necessarily the knowledge on how to do it. And if there were workshops or resources made available within the university that they're at or the institution that they're at, will probably go a long way to kind of helping push things towards being more accessible. I think also, I guess your question also kind of touched upon like, if the library wanted to create an open access publication or resource, what else could they do? And, in my field, we talk a lot about user-centered design. So whenever we talk about creating systems or services for users, especially for diverse users, like disabled people, for instance, you want to have them involved in that process. You want to really employ co-design methods. And so I feel like it's really beneficial to bring people in, because I think that things haven't changed in even though the technology's changed and, we're moving to more digital publishing, I think a lot of the approaches that people take to setting up things like these new services hasn't changed very much. And so I think like it's probably been a case where a lot of these organizations have just kind of had an idea and they think it's a great idea, and in practice or in principle it kind of seems like it is, but then they just go off and they build the system, and then it creates these systemic barriers that have much wider implications. And so I think if you were going to redesign or the library's own approach to kind of publishing within the institution, I think you want to kind of start bringing people on board to kind of get their feedback and really kind of do some proper requirement gathering there, and testing of systems.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate those answers. We've had to do a workaround with our publications. We're actually converting our PDFs into an HTML document and uploading a supplemental file in a way that is 100% accessible. So that's just a way that works with our publisher that we are contracted with. So I think part of it might also be just we have to almost wait for our publishers to catch up with these requirements too, because it does seem like there's a reluctance to improve on their end and make it easier for people trying to make publications accessible. So I saw a couple things come in here for So for Lisa, could you give us some examples of how libraries can leverage licensing contracts to ensure accessibility? What is some common language that is included to ensure accessibility?
Sure. So first of all, we have a lot going for us in the fact that there's legal requirements that can be invoked in contract language. And what I've given in the chat right now is a link to the Center for Research Libraries model license. And if you access the 2014, I think it is, PDF or Word document, you'll see that the model license includes a clause or a section on disabilities compliance, which says, they will comply with the American Disabilities Act. Important, remember, since not all of our vendors are in the United States, we need to sort of say, so this is our standard. And that they will, sorry, I'm kind of looking at the text here, in a manner consistent with the Web Accessibility Initiative Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So there's an invocation of the WCAG there. And then we are also asking in this model license that the vendors provide a completed VPAT. The voluntary product accessibility template is available, which documents compliance with Section 508 of the federal standards. And then what will happen if it doesn't comply. So this is fairly standard, and you will see in most cases. So the part of it is this is not particularly radical because librarians put this in place quite some time ago as far as in our license agreements, and our universities typically have them in our license agreements as well. Now, if I could just take a moment to say, we put a lot of things in our license agreements that I'm not confident we ever go check on. So, if somebody gives you a VPAT and it says it's not accessible, does anyone, or it says it is accessible, do we ever go check to make sure that it's true? I suspect we don't go check in most cases on most of the clauses that we negotiate. So it's absolutely great that it's in the contract. But unless we move to auditing compliance with what is promised in the contract, and this goes for all kinds of things, right? Uptime, accessibility, preservation, privacy, data protections, et cetera, we don't know if what we've contracted for is what's actually being delivered. And so there is a limit to what license language can do for us.
Great, thank you. I like the fact that auditing needs to happen too, just because it's in the contract. So Gareth, a question for you. How does your research work in concert with others in your lab in Golisano? Could you give us any hints or insights into the work that's being done related to this?
Yeah, no, I definitely can. So I guess probably one of the most closely related projects that's happening within care is work that's being conducted by Dr. Kristen Shinohara. So Kristen's another assistant professor here within the School of Information. Kristen has an NSF-funded project which is investigating the barriers that graduate students with disabilities encounter in meeting their program requirements. So she's had a few publications on this topic now, which are really great and very interesting. One of the recent papers that's actually going to be presented next month at the CSCW conference is looking, it was looking at the usability and accessibility of advanced tools that vision impaired graduate students are using. So the work that I talked about in my talk, we were kind of approaching it from, we were kind of approaching like how our papers are accessible and what challenges there are in making our papers accessible. I'm kind of thinking about accessibility as a benefit to the end user or reader in this case. But Kristen's work's actually kind of like flipping that a little bit and thinking, well, because one thing that we didn't it did sort of come up in our paper. We actually did speak to a couple authors who do have disabilities, and we talk about it in our paper. They do reflect on how that also has implications on how they're able to make their work accessible. But no, Kristen's project is kind of looking more at kind of the graduate student experience and kind of the challenges for conducting research and publishing research, because again, like a lot of the tools or systems that they encounter or have to use throughout their degree program are often inaccessible. So that's one piece of work anyway that I can kind of share with everyone that's going on within CARE. I mean, CARE is great. It's for folk who don't know, it's the Center for Accessibility and Inclusion Research, but we're such a large group that there's so much research that goes on within our group that kind of spans all areas of computing accessibility.
Great, thank you. So Lisa, I have another question for you. You may have covered some of this in your last answer. Do licensing contracts, and I should warn you, as someone with dyslexia, when anyone says contract, half of my brain goes to sleep. So you might have already covered this. Do contracts have boilerplate language about accessibility, or does it differ by institutions? Have we seen changes in these contracts with larger publication packages that group I'm sorry, the line flipped up and now I got to refocus. With larger publication packages that group tens or hundreds of journal databases together. Did that make sense?
Yeah. So I want to be clear that I am not a licensing librarian. This is not the work that I do, but I've read a fair number of licenses, particularly because I'm also currently running a research project called Licensing Privacy. So different focus in the licensing, but similar. So the reality is that if you pull up 7 different Wiley contracts with U.S. institutions, they're going to read a lot the same across most of it. So publishers are not going to have a different level of accessibility available to the University of Illinois patrons than they have to RIT patrons, because it's the platform. So this is where, this kind of language is very, very boilerplate when it comes to accessibility. Again, I think in large part, this also comes down to the fact that on both sides, there's I'm going to characterize it this way, is accessibility in the contract? Yep, great. It is not actually testing whether accessibility exists for users of the product. It's certainly not testing whether accessibility exists for our our e-licensing librarians who might have to use the tools as employees, about whether the employee side, the back end of these tools is accessible. But let's just stay with the front end for a second. I just cannot repeat often enough that putting something in a contract does not make it actual in the world.
Good advice. Great. Thank you. So we are running close to the end of our time here. I haven't had any more questions come in, so I'm going to give you guys a chance maybe for last words, last thoughts before we close off the event. Garreth, I think I'll put you on the spot and have you start off first.
Yeah, no, thank you. And to Lisa's last point, I just want to reiterate that in our conferences that we organize, like the CHI conference, for instance, we try and advocate for accessibility and make it like a part of all aspects of the conference organization. The contracts have statements for accessibility, and then the vendors don't actually follow through with that. So it's a nightmare. To your point, Nicholas, the kind of, I guess one thing that I want to say, I never really touched upon this in the talk, we cover it in our paper, and maybe it's something for the library to think a little bit more about, is alternatives to PDFs. So it came up earlier about like the role that publishers have on this topic, and how often there's a lot of these issues and limitations with like accessible or inaccessible papers in this case. And I mentioned that ACM have a new publication process. The challenge is that you submit your files and it generates an inaccessible PDF for screen reader users. So that's a whole thing. But the other aspect to this service that I didn't mention, which is more of a positive, one of the reasons that they have this new publication system called TABS, it will create an HTML version of the paper. And the HTML version is a lot more accessible. And it's also a lot more customizable for individual people's needs. It's based on HTML and CSS and so on. We think that there's a lot of potential with this in the future. So I think the libraries maybe should consider alternative submission formats. Now, PDFs aren't necessarily going anywhere quickly because the benefit of the PDF is being able to share it easily among folk. And that's not as easy to do with HTML pages when it's maybe behind like a login screen and you need to have the credentials to access it. But the kind of the point anyway is that if we can find alternative ways of sharing our papers, whether it's like a Word file or an HTML paper, that can go some way to make things a lot more accessible, but it's going to require more effort in, I guess, encouraging authors or finding ways for authors to provide papers in those formats. And maybe that's like the case where the library, when it requires like a dissertation to be submitted to the repository, rather than it being a PDF, maybe it's the source file of some kind that is that can be accessed more easily for different users. So that's the last thing I'll say.
Great. Thank you, Gareth. Lisa?
So
last words?
I'll say two things. The first thing I want to say is we've been talking about all of this with, I think, a kind of an assumption that there's a good faith effort that's at least intended for accessibility. And I would really like words with the authors who are submitting preprint PDFs where they have clearly intentionally created an image only of their text. That is, in my mind, not even good faith effort. So I think a lot of what we uncovered is people not knowing how to do things better. But there's something here that's really uncomfortable to me about people who seem to be intentionally disabling access to their work. That is very puzzling as well, because I think you'd want it to be able to be indexed and other things. So there's something very strange going on here. I think the other thing I would just sort of raise for us is the one thing that I think everyone could do. It's a really simple thing, because no matter what, accessibility is something we always have to strive for, but we'll never have 100%, right? And a kind of accommodation that is a well-established accommodation is help from a human being. Another human being is a mechanism for creating accessibility. Not a single platform that we saw, and I can't think of most library websites that make this very foregrounded either, which is to say, if you are having an accessibility challenge, please contact us. And here's your person, and here's the procedures we have set up on our side to ensure that this second layer of accessibility is provided to you. So, maybe as a library, we can't remedy all the problems on our platforms at the platform level, but we can remedy from another standpoint, if you have accessed a PDF via our services that is not accessible, here's the support we provide to you to do a human-based accessibility layer over the top of the technological ones. And so it's the major recommendation for preprint servers and the like too, like there is an option if you want to provide it.
Wonderful. I can't think of a better way to end this panel discussion than with that message. Everyone who's attended, there is a link in the chat for our survey. And that will help us create next year's event. Your input is appreciated. I want to thank Lisa and Gareth for joining us today. It was a very stimulating conversation and very timely for me, because I've been struggling with the effort of making all of our publications more accessible. So I do appreciate your time. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.